Welcome, I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. Thanks for joining us tonight for our lecture on international trade, the internet, and cross-border data flows, which is an impressive title, but not quite as impressive as our speaker, Josh Meltzer, tonight to deliver on that topic. This is Josh's second trip out as a Brookings Mountain West scholar, and we tapped him to speak about a year and a half ago or so on his other specialty, which was climate change and international trade. But tonight we'll talk about a very timely topic on internet information and data flows across international borders. An important topic here in Las Vegas as we think about everything from the possible or imminent development of internet gaming in our core industry, but all IT affected businesses, which virtually means all businesses today have that issue. We as consumers have that issue, as do our companies and our nation. And I'm sure you'll have lots of questions for Josh. We'll try and save some time at the end for that. I'm going to bring Josh up here. He's a fellow at Brookings in the Global Economics and Development Program, Australian by birth, University of Michigan educated, including his law degrees from there. He has academic connections with the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies and Georgetown Law School. Like our visiting scholars, he's been talking to UNLV classes, both undergraduate and graduate students, meeting with colleagues to explore some research options. So I'm going to bring Josh up here to get us started.
Hi everyone, and first I just want to thank Bill for the kind words and the introduction, and for the great program that you have got going here with Brookings. It's a pleasure and honour to be here, and thank you all for making the trip out tonight. And I'm going to try to speak slowly and clearly. I know the Australian accent can come across somewhat strange at times, so if there's any doubts about what I'm saying, raise your hands. What I want to do tonight is, I come at this, I guess, to start off with from trade policy, trade law perspective, and so I'm going to talk about the internet and cross-border data flows initially, and then I want to relate it back to why it's significant from a trade perspective, and look at the way that trade institutions such as the World Trade Organization and the way trade rules need to be developed in order to support a lot of the opportunities around the internet and cross-border data flows. So I guess starting with the idea about the potential for sort of commerce and economic exchange online, and I'm not talking about anything particularly new here. The idea that you can sort of have a business which is online is clearly something that's been around for a while. Certainly, we saw the 1990s and the dot-com boom, and we can think about a range of companies that started then and which are incredibly successful today. Amazon, being one of them, but we can also think about a lot of companies that started up and didn't go anywhere, that failed. Pets.com, Boo.com. I mean, the list goes on. But I mention this because certainly since the 1990s, in a sense, like the internet has very much grown up and developed, and so has the opportunities of the internet. And in many respects, the new internet, in a sense, is often referred to as Web 2.0. And this sort of captures a number of developments in the internet, which is significant when we start thinking about the potential of the internet and what cross-border data flows mean for international trade. I think one of the key developments of the new internet, Web 2.0, is this idea of harnessing the collective intelligence of users. And a good example, I think, of this is one thinks of Wikipedia, right? Which is, an online user-generated encyclopedia. So it's essentially a collection of the intelligence of its users, right? Another example of sort of the new internet is something called crowdfunding, which you probably know something about, but essentially it's the idea that you can come along with a good business idea and it's a platform where people can make their own assessment about its commercial viability and actually decide whether to fund it. Right? So it's utilising the analytical wisdom and financial capacity of internet users. Certainly another element that's become more prevalent with the development of the internet has been the global nature of the internet, and with that the seamless and rapid cross-border movement of data. And the data bit of this is important. I'm going to certainly talk a lot more about the movement of data across borders and why this is significant from a trade perspective. But part of it is what we're seeing is increasingly very large quantities of data are being aggregated. Aggregated both domestically but also aggregated internationally. So data is constantly moving across multiple jurisdictions very rapidly and being aggregated in what's often referred to now as big data. And there's now the computing power and capacity to analyse this data to produce a whole range of new, very important insights. Some of them, obviously commercial with economic benefits, other with more sort of social applications. There's actually a McKinsey report recently looking at sort of the big data benefits for companies and businesses, and one of the sort of conclusions was that for most businesses they can use big data in different ways to improve their bottom line by potentially what they estimate to be up to 60%. So just from that figure alone we begin to see that the opportunities there are potentially very significant. But big data is being used in a whole host of other ways. For instance, using Google searches for things like flu is actually being used to help identify a lot more accurately instances where the flu is actually arising in the US. Another way that essentially big data and internet users are being used is to respond to natural disasters in a more timely and focused fashion. So for example, with the recent large hurricane in the Philippines, Hurricane Haiyan, there was basically social mapping was used where tweets with words such as appeals for help or shortages of medical supply were then essentially mapped to pinpoint locations where these type of resources were actually needed, and resources could then be targeted in a more accurate fashion. And they're really just a couple of examples of the uses and opportunities for big data going forward. I guess this brings us to highlighting the point that it's really this global nature of cross-border data flows and the global nature of the internet, which is creating a whole lot of new opportunity, both on the economic and the non-economic side. And a lot of this is also not only going to be concentrated in the US or in developed countries where actually a lot of the benefits of the internet have traditionally been, but increasingly we're going to see this in developing countries. Part of this is going to happen as more and more people in developing countries actually get internet access. So currently, across the developed world, approximately 80% of people have internet access compared to approximately 30% in the developed world, but that number in the developed world is rapidly increasing. There's actually a figure by the International Telecommunications Union that there's currently around 2.5 billion internet users, but that number is expected to be 5 billion by the end of this decade, and most of that growth will be in the developing world. But so in a sense, that in and of itself is just one place and one example of where the benefits are going to be derived. But the impact of the internet and cross-border data flows on the capacity for businesses to go global is what's really important here. And that's sort of the beginning of where some of the links with the international trade and international economic piece lie. And there's sort of I sort of think about this in two kind of broadly different ways. One is the internet now being understood as an input into businesses. And this happens in a whole variety of ways. So for example, if you think about cloud services now, essentially what you can do as a business is you can have all of your software that you need to run your business located on a cloud, right? Basically on a data server located somewhere. And this significantly reduces costs. You don't have to have an IT person necessarily on staff. Access to the software can be significantly cheaper. It's automatically updated. It's actually essentially looked after by whoever runs that cloud computing service. And because this can be sort of done at scale, these services can be provided to individual businesses at significantly lower costs. It also means that you often don't need a lot of IT infrastructure. A lot of the service and computers and the actual memory and storage is also now happening on the cloud. So a lot of, this is just one example of how, what's become a core, essentially, business input, like your IT infrastructure and software, now can be located somewhere else, cost significantly reduced. And if you're a small business in particular, that's a real benefit. Another example, take Skype. We've all, I'm sure, used something like Skype, if not Skype itself, and you know that if you're speaking to someone else who's also got Skype, you're essentially having a phone call for free. And this happens whether you are situated in the same city, the same state, the same country, or across, borders. And so if you're a small company, again, wanting to go global, these are the types of costs that you would normally confront, which are being significantly reduced as a result of the global nature of the internet. Another interesting thing, which is easy to, I think, take for granted, is access to strategic information. A lot of studies has actually been done on why small, medium-sized enterprises don't engage in international trade, don't go global. And one of the things that comes out from all of this is the cost and difficulty of actually learning about overseas markets, understanding the consumer trends, understanding the regulatory environment, understanding basically what's needed to sell and engage in commercial activities overseas. More or less now, the internet provides a lot of this information for free. But whereas previously, this was a very expensive, time-consuming exercise that essentially only large global corporations had the wherewithal to do. And this is just another way that internet access as an input is allowing small companies to go global. And I could go on. There's many, many different ways that you can start thinking about the internet as a very important input into a whole range of companies. And I guess that's kind of another important point here, is that this is certainly not an IT industry issue anymore. This is sort of a broad global economic issue where whether you're in sort of very non-traditional IT sectors, whether it's blue-collar manufacturing through to your services sector, your internet as an input is crucial for all of them. The other, I guess, way that I think about the impact of the internet in this sense on economics and growth and trade is not so much the internet as providing you with an electronic storefront, which it certainly still does, but how internet platforms essentially have developed which allow companies to go global. And the example I use here is that of eBay. eBay we probably still think of maybe as an online auction site, but eBay's really evolved now to be essentially a platform for business. And there's actually a lot of eBay actually tracks this pretty closely, and there's actually some really interesting data that eBay has now, which essentially shows that a lot of the companies that actually use eBay are often small or medium-sized enterprises, and a majority of them are actually now becoming global traders. And not only selling their goods to neighbouring Canada, but are actually selling their goods to 6 or 7 or 8 different countries all over the world. And in fact, these companies that use eBay not only are going global, but are actually surviving longer and having actually better chances of success, are growing quicker, their revenues are increasing more rapidly than companies that don't engage in these types of internet platforms. Now, all of this is about open access to the internet and requires the ability to move data quickly and seamlessly and information across borders, and I'll get into this a little bit more. But I just firstly want to get into now, I think, a little bit of what are the challenges, what are the restrictions to really developing this potential. And before I go there, I just want to mention this briefly. Like, when one thinks of the internet, I think it's useful, even though the internet's gone global, it's still, I think, useful to think about the internet really as a series of networks, not one global network, but a network of, whether it's government networks or individuals or company networks that connect themselves via servers and other mechanisms that then make the internet global. And when one thinks about particularly the links between countries, often this is done by what are called internet exchange points, which tend to be connected by cables, often undersea cables. And I just mention this because, you know, it's useful to think about the physical nature of the internet, because it's often there that governments are able to actually, there are essentially choke points where governments can intervene to actually influence and restrict the flow of information and data. And this is partly what we're beginning to see. So in a sense, I think the point we're at now is we're at a place where the internet's really gone through an evolution since it sort of first evolved and became, you know, widely available in the 1990s into this sort of new Web 2.0, this new internet environment. The potential on the economic and as a means for driving international trade is significant, particularly not only for the developed countries but for developing countries, not only for large multinational companies but now increasingly for small companies. So it's allowing actors to become global and to become engaged in the global economy in ways which historically have actually been completely unprecedented. You know, the whole trading system essentially has been more or less set up and predicated on the basis of large companies engaging in it. And that's true from the rules as much as it is for the infrastructure underlying the trade. I mean, if you want to move goods across borders, you know, the system of transport, or, you know, freight transport, etc., is often set up for the idea that you're going to be moving bulk quantities of things. It's not set up for or it's not well set up for at least the movement of small goods and quantities across borders. And so, you know, the change that is there and the potential is significant. At the same time, what we're also seeing is an increasing propensity for governments around the world, for a variety of different reasons, to interfere in the internet, to censor the movement of information and data. And it's these types of, these intersecting challenges which is you know, the focus in the sense of some of the work that I've been doing here. So I guess the question is, you know, why do governments intervene in the internet? You know, what do they do? What's the reasons for it? And you know, when you start picking it apart, you see that there's a multiple range of reasons for government intervention in the internet. And some of it is arguably, you know, reasonably legitimate. So let me give you a few examples of things that I would consider to be, you know, legitimate interferences. One of them might be privacy. You know, there's a big debate ongoing now, not only in the US but in a lot of countries, about, you know, privacy of data online. What's, you know, the proper role for companies in protecting it? What's the proper role for governments in, you know, getting companies to protect it, and these type of things. If one looks to the EU's had a fairly comprehensive privacy regime for a while now, and one of the parts of the privacy regime is that they prohibit the movement of data out from the EU to a third country that essentially doesn't have a privacy regime which provides a similar level of protection to the EU. Now, in a sense, the EU had to go down that path because, you know, if they didn't prohibit the movement of cross-border data flows, it would have been very easy to circumvent the EU privacy regime by simply moving data to another jurisdiction. But it creates a whole range of issues in terms of the ability to actually engage in commercial activity in the EU. I mean, and this is really not only a restriction if you're an EU company who wants to export data, but it's actually really a restriction on if you're a business outside the EU who wants to sell goods or services into the EU. Because often if you want to provide a service into the EU, you're going to have to collect some data from your customers. Right? And so the ability for that data to be actually collected and taken outside of the EU is essentially premised on the type of privacy regime that your country has. Another area where there's regular interference is to protect intellectual property rights, right? So you know, whether it comes to, you know, copyright enforcement, when people are like illegally downloading movies and videos, you know, there's different ways and regimes for, you know, preventing that, for creating obligations on companies to stop that happening, etc. So that's another area. And you know, and there's probably what I would say is, you know, there's sort of like a moral rationale at times for interfering in the internet. So governments around the world have got different views on, you know, when content becomes offensive and when they should not allow their citizens to access that, so whether that's forms of pornography in some country, you know, there might be sort of religious overtones in other countries, but essentially, you know, there is government intervention around them. But there are certainly a range of other reasons and other restrictions that we're increasingly seeing. Some of it is political, right? So, when there was the Arab Spring, when there was the uprising in Iran a few years ago, Egypt more recently, Tunisia, governments in all these countries restricted access to social networking sites, they restricted access to Twitter, so in a sense, at times of political upheaval, particularly, governments have intervened in, the workings and operations of information access to that, and so that's been another outcome there. But we also observe a lot of what I would just call really commercial discriminatory restrictions. So one example is in China, if you want to do a Google search, what often happens is your Google search will be redirected to Weibo, which is basically the Chinese competitor to Google, right? So, this is the type of sort of behaviour which I would just classify as sort of discriminatory in the sense that is, clearly aimed at, propping up and building up, domestic competitors, right? And you see a range of that going on in different countries. I've actually, interestingly enough, like over the last sort of 12 months or so, have been working with a former congressman, in fact, David Dreyer from California, and we've been meeting with businesses, both here in the US but also in the Asia Pacific region, to learn more about how businesses use data internally, what it means to them, what the strategic importance, and also to get a better grasp on what some of the proposed regulations in terms of restricting cross-border data flows mean for businesses and what their commercial implications are. And I just want to give you one example because I think I want to highlight this because a lot of what's being proposed, even if it's being done from a position of reasonable regulatory policies, is potentially going to have a whole lot of unintended and negative economic consequences. And one of them, which is being seen increasingly around the world, and not only in developing countries but in the EU as well, is this concept of data localization or data sovereignty, which is basically the idea that if you're going to collect data from citizens, it should be held in that country, it shouldn't be stored in jurisdictions overseas. And there's often a multiple range of rationales for this. One of it tends to be a little bit of an industrial policy flavour. So there's often an idea that, look, if we can get Microsoft to build a data centre in our country, we're going to sort of develop a bit of a data centre industry, we're going to generate some jobs and this type of thing. Some of it's kind of from the view of law enforcement. Sometimes there's a perception that, look, you can't, if you need to access data, if someone does a financial transaction and you need, law enforcement needs to get access to that, it's problematic if that data is stored in another location. Like what are the mechanisms for getting it back into that jurisdiction that needs it? And there's also a view, and I think that data somehow is more secure if it's located in your jurisdiction than in another jurisdiction. But I think having spoken to various companies about this and through our own work, one of the things that becomes clear is actually a lot of these aims are not going to be fulfilled, and on top of that, there's probably going to be some unintended consequences. So just taking the industrial sort of policy jobs view, one of the things that's fairly obvious is that data centres don't generate lots of jobs. You basically build the centre, so there's sort of like a one-off construction effort. But if you've ever been to data centres, they tend not to be big employers. Large banks of servers, which are often run by skeletal staff of IT software engineers, and that's about it. So they're not necessarily big job generators in and of themselves. When it comes to the data security issue, there's actually, I was talking to Bill about this. There's a large data center located in this town in Las Vegas right now. One of the key reasons this data center is here is because this town and this part of the US is largely free from natural disasters. There's no earthquakes, there's no hurricanes, there's no floods. And data centers are located across the US and in particular places around the world, partly based on an assessment of their risk profile, and that includes the extent that they're going to be particular natural disasters. It also includes issues like political stability, economic stability, access to electricity. But there's a range of sort of key parameters that are thought about in terms of where to locate data centres to make those data centres as safe and as reliable and as secure as possible. So the idea that you should have to build data centres in every jurisdiction where you're operating might actually lead to more data insecurity because you're locating data essentially in places which might, for a variety of reasons, actually not be that secure over the longer term. And the other I think really important thing here is that if regulators start requiring data to be located domestically, what you're going to ultimately do is you're going to raise the cost of key services like cloud computing, right? Because so instead of companies being able to scale up and locate the data where it's optimal and having to incur the expenses of locating data in every single jurisdiction, the cost of a lot of these key inputs is going to go up. So again, if we go back to what I was saying previously and recognise that this is an input into a broader economic activity. In fact, the companies and the businesses and the entrepreneurs in that country are probably going to be saddled with higher cloud computing costs and services, which is going to affect the competitiveness and productivity of their economy more broadly. So, for the idea of creating a few extra jobs in a data centre, the costs are potentially fairly significant. I think also, and I kind of want to just mention this because it's obviously relevant now, which is, part of the way that the world is thinking about the internet and its commercial opportunities is increasingly framed through it's an American thing. And this I think has had a different tinge following the Snowden revelations, right? And it is a fact that the internet started in the US, the commercialization started of it in the US. And really, if you think about all these new internet service providers, so whether it's an eBay as an internet platform, whether it's a Google or a Yahoo as a web search opportunity, whether it's the social networking sites, whether it's IBM or Microsoft, the list goes on, right? They're all very large, US corporate players. And that really, that's just been how it is. Europe's looked on with envy and wondered why it doesn't have an IT sector like the US, but so be it. But, this is sort of, the tone of the debate's really changed since, the whole NSA issues come out. And I'm not planning to get into that in this talk, but I mention it because I think one of the things that it's really highlighted is the importance of trust in the internet as a key ingredient for people's willingness to engage in it for commerce and a whole range of reasons, and to provide data and to provide personal data online. And in fact, you sort of see globally how companies are now positioning themselves as we're not a US cloud-based service provider, we're not a US internet service provider. In fact, and you're seeing this in a big way in the EU, in fact, where EU cloud service providers are sort of saying, well, our data is going to be in the EU, you're not going to be subject to NSA surveillance. And there's been a couple of surveys coming out which have actually highlighted, I think, the current economic costs. There's one by the Cloud Security Alliance, which found that 56% of their respondents were hesitant to work with US cloud-based service providers. And another survey came out which found that the cost to the cloud computing industry from the NSA revelations are as high as $35 billion over the next 3 years. And that's just the cloud computing sector. This is certainly also, I think, coloured the way that governments are thinking and rationalising their intervention in cross-border data flows. So I guess let's transition now in terms of what needs to be done. And currently in terms of trade rules on cross-border data flows, so I just want to reiterate, so cross-border data flows in and of themselves are key to underpinning economic activity, right? And in many respects are themselves going to constitute a trade in either a good or a service, and we can talk about that more. But, there are some limited rules that are currently being developed as, particularly the US, I think, appreciates the significance of this issue. And I won't go into the technicalities of where the rules are and what they say, but essentially the most recent free trade agreement the United States did, which is the one with Korea, which was passed by Congress in 2011, I believe, or 2010, includes some language for the first time, essentially saying that the country should allow cross-border data flows. But as you'll recall, because there are some legitimate reasons for restrictions on it, these also need to be balanced out with giving governments a scope to actually do some things which are legitimate as well. And so the rules are sort of really a first step, but don't speak too strongly to the issue. Now, in terms of what we can do going forward, the World Trade Organization is probably the place to start at least. Now, the WTO is an international organisation. It's essentially responsible for largely for international economic governance broadly, but it's certainly focused on the trade side. It's a Geneva-based organisation. It's got largely global membership, 158, 159 countries. Russia joined last year, and it's got comprehensive rules of the road, and it's got a very rigorous dispute settlement mechanism in Geneva, which governments use all the time. It's got sanctions for non-compliance. So it's a serious sort of place to first think about addressing this. And of course, if we think about this as a trade issue, the WTO would certainly be a natural place to do it. But the WTO was created in 1995. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think back to when I started using email, I think I was using it kind of in 1995, maybe a little bit before that. I was in Australia at the time. I don't know if we were at the cutting edge of email. You guys might have been using it a few years earlier. But the point is really that the internet was very much at its infancy, and particularly its uses. And certainly there was there was very limited understanding amongst the negotiators at the time of the importance of the internet for international commerce and trade. And so not surprisingly, the WTO rules don't directly really get at this issue in any real important way. Now, that said, there has been some work essentially looking at the internet issue done within the WTO Secretariat. And there was recently a ministerial meeting which is basically all the WTO ministers met, which they do every 2 years. The last one was in Bali just recently in December, where they said, look, we need to do more work on this issue. We need to look more carefully at the different dimensions of the impact of the internet and international trade. So there's clearly a growing global awareness and, in a sense, a consensus that this is an area where new trade disciplines and rules might be needed, and that WTO could be a place where some of this could be developed. The WTO is going to have some trouble getting, in terms of developing actually new rules. This is going to take a while in WTO, partly because there's a thing underway in the WTO which has been underway since 2001 called the Doha Round, which is essentially a multilateral trade negotiation which has been very, very slow, very difficult to finish, and essentially until that is concluded, there's very little to no space to sort of introduce new topics onto the negotiating agenda. So while I think the WTO is certainly going to be a place to do some intellectual work in terms of clarifying the issues and trying to develop some consensus globally around what might be done in terms of actually negotiating sort of hard rules in the next 2, 3, 5 years, maybe 2, 3 years, certainly it's not going to be happening in the WTO. So that's why I turn to free trade agreements, and there's 2 or 3 which are probably the most sort of important potentially. And one of them is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Negotiation. You may know something about that, but essentially it includes 12 countries, including the United States, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Chile, a variety of countries in the Asia-Pacific region. It's kind of a big deal. The countries that make up the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, represent about 40% of global GDP. So it's a lot, and it's with very clear ambitions for this to become a much bigger deal, like for countries essentially to join over time. And there's a whole bunch of countries which are already indicating that they want to join. So I think the potential for the TPP to actually expand is also is also very real. So getting some new rules and disciplines on supporting cross-border data flows into this agreement could actually be very important because of its potential already with the countries in it, but also its growth potential. And what we sort of want essentially is we need at least at a minimum rules which commit governments to the free flow of information across borders. And what the challenge really is defining out how do you give appropriate scope for governments to essentially restrict cross-border data flows, like under what circumstances is it reasonable, is it legitimate? And even once you've identified when it's reasonable, legitimate, you really want governments, regulators to do it in a way which is least restrictive on the movement of data across borders. There may be other ways that you can get at a legitimate aim without restricting cross-border data flows, and if you do it, you should be required to do that before you do the more kind of trade restrictive action. So that's essentially the type of disciplines that are now being, and this is actually now being drafted and looked at and negotiated in the context of the TPP. Another trade agreement which is important and significant is the Transatlantic Deal, which is now being negotiated between the US and the EU. And again, this is also a big deal. I'll just throw out a couple of figures to give you an example. $1 trillion in goods and services and trade in goods and services between the US and the EU annually, $4 trillion in investment in each other's economies. So I just say that because we talk a lot about US-China trade relationships, which are certainly large and significant, but the US-EU trade and economic relationship dwarfs that and is very significant. And so if the US and the EU can agree on some new rules around cross-border data flows, the sheer sort of economic momentum and weight of these two economic units essentially make those rules in a de facto sense global, because companies essentially have to adjust to comply with those rules if they want to sell into either the US or the EU markets. So doing something there can also be important not only for the US and the EU, but can have global implications. I'll just finally talk about, this is another important negotiation. It's called the Trade in International Services Agreement. And essentially what it is, it's a negotiation to liberalise barriers to services trade. And services trade is really important in this context because increasing a lot of the commerce that's going to happen over the internet is going to be the provision of services across borders. I mean, when you think about how you use the internet to engage in international trade, there's sort of two ways of doing it, right? One is you get online and you search and then you order it and the actual parcel or good turns up at your door. The other is that you actually consume that product or service online, right? And services are increasingly really important part of international trade. I mean, we don't tend to think about trade in services so much, but 80% of US GDP is in services. And the US runs a services surplus every single year, and an increasing services surplus. So the US sells more services overseas than it imports. And this is everything from consulting, legal, accounting, engineering, architecture, medical, tourism, education, and the list goes on. And a lot of these services are increasingly, being able to be traded online. So reducing barriers to services trade is important, just in and of itself economically, but also in terms of the way that the internet can actually really power this is also significant. And so that trade agreement is also another important place where if you can have commitments on cross-border data flows, that can also be significant. So I think, and I guess the last thing I want to say is that while trade rules are important, because this is, in a sense, a new and emerging issue, what's also needed here is really to expand upon and develop the understanding that governments and regulators actually have about the importance of cross-border data flows for their economy. And I guess I just get back to what I was originally saying at the beginning of this talk, which is that, if we think about the internet as a platform, right? So no longer as just an IT sector, but actually as a platform for a broad range of economic activity, then really the focus no longer is on, hey, let's replicate a Google or let's replicate a Facebook, but it's about let's use these internet service providers to actually, underpin the competitiveness and productivity of our economy more broadly. I mean, and in a sense, then, the internet in this respect has really become, it's a bit like electricity. It's like a general purpose technology which sort of underpins a whole lot of economic activity. So part of what's also needed going forward is to develop, in a sense, a dialogue between governments and between regulators to sort of highlight and understand the broad economic potential now of the internet, not just for a particular sector, but for their economies broadly, and that basically, encouraging and maintaining the open nature of the internet and the free flow of information and data is actually ultimately going to produce, the economic benefits that they're looking for. So I think I'll leave it at that, and we're going to open it to Q&A. I think, Bill, you're going to moderate.
Yeah, we have time for a few questions. I'm sure you've given people some pause and some thoughtful questions. Who would like to start? Miss?
Well, you spoke on the EU's privacy controls for cross-national data. What about the United States? Do we have any kind of policy in place, or do we just not have one?
So the US approach is actually almost diametrically opposed to the EU approach, which is not to say it doesn't have an approach, but it's got a very different approach. The US approach is essentially requires companies to assume responsibility for protecting the privacy of the data that they collect, with an oversight role and a monitoring role by the Federal Trade Commission. And so it's not a comprehensive sort of legislative agenda which the EU does have, but it's more a bottom-up approach which places the emphasis on the companies to do the right thing, with penalties for release of private data. And it's been, I think there's a sort of a view in the US that, yes, we don't have a complex sort of single place you can go to understand what the privacy regime is like, but in terms of outcomes, it's actually providing a better level of privacy protection than the EU, because the view is that the EU sort of has a comprehensive, essentially directive about how privacy should be looked after, but then there's not that much on the implementation and follow-up end, whereas on the US side, it's essentially a bottom-up approach, but with a focus more on essentially making sure that the data never gets released because of the penalties for breach.
Sir, right here.
Yes, very, very interesting talk. There's, like about 4% of our GDP is an imbalance with primarily China, and China runs big surpluses in the trade area, and as does Germany. Is there ways that data and the flows of data could help to pinpoint and maybe help to reduce or help to improve the balance of the commerce too?
So I think that one, I mean, this is maybe not exactly what you're getting at, but certainly if you look at where the US has got a lot of potential in terms of improving export capacity, it's certainly around the services piece. And which is intimately tied to the cross-border data flow need. Because in many respects, if you take a college class online, or if you engage with a therapeutic sort of mechanism online, or if you're going to sort of hire a consultant or a financial services provider online, I mean, what is happening there is an exchange of data and information. So in many senses, the actual provision of the service is in itself a cross-border data flow. Opening up those sectors in places like China, I think, could start the process of correcting that bilateral trade imbalance.
Is there somebody over here? Yes, Bernard?
Yeah, I'm having trouble distinguishing between the storage and the transmission of data, whereas the transmission, as I understand it, is inherently international. It'll bounce around. I mean, even if you're communicating across the street, physically, the data flow may be international.
Yeah.
Now, is there even an ability to control that, the nature of the internet with respect to that? I may be naive, but let's say I was outside the country and I wanted to access my bank account. It would seem to me that once I logged onto the internet, I could access it from anywhere as easily. So, in a sense, what's the issue with respect to the flow? Is it a matter of a country's ability to, absolutely limit the flow across its border, or is it something else?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And you're absolutely correct in that, often you may be communicating with someone domestically, but your data may actually travel globally in order to get there. And part of that, I think, highlights the disconnect often between the way regulators think about data and what they're actually requiring companies to do and the way the internet operates. And this is part of the conversation that's sort of happening at the moment, which is that, we can keep your data locally, but the data's often moved anyway internationally. Part of it is, though, that even if it is moving, the storage bit is still about, literally having a copy of it in a sort of domestic server rather than in a server outside that location for the variety of reasons that I mentioned. But you do run into this sort of situation where you may, in fact, require the servers and the data to be held domestically, even though the process of accumulating that data may have meant that it moved, in a sense, internationally anyway. And so, this is sort of, part of, I think, an education process in the sense of, getting regulators in many senses to understand simple basics about the infrastructure of the internet and the nature of how information flows anyway. Yeah.
So over here first, and then we'll.
How does network neutrality play into all of this? I mean, with the ability of service providers to discriminate in the priority of data delivery, especially with services like video streaming services and things like that, are they drafting? Is that a consideration in the rules that they're drafting on whether or not that's going to be permitted, or if the service providers are going to have to adhere to a network neutrality kind of framework?
Yeah. So when you look at trade agreements, and I'll just say this briefly as a precursor to answering your question. It's common to think about trade agreements as essentially dealing with nuts and bolts and tariffs, which they do, but it's increasingly a smaller and smaller part of them. I think a certainly more accurate way of thinking about trade agreements is thinking about them as very comprehensive economic integration agreements that will deal with everything from your competition policy, telecommunications policy, anything to do with intellectual property, the whole range of services, the transparency of your governance system, what your domestic court systems processes might look like. And part of it is there's often a lot on telecoms regulation, whether or not you permit competition under what conditions. And network neutrality has increasingly been, in a sense, inserted into trade agreements to reflect the sort of the regime here in the US, where more or less, there's been. The internet service providers have been unable to discriminate based on sort of the content, and there's been this sort of ongoing debate here about whether service providers should be able to charge more for sort of the types of downloads that are, high volume and take up a lot of essentially bandwidth like videos. And there's actually, I haven't looked at this closely, but there's actually been a very recent federal court decision which is possibly beginning to challenge the network neutrality setup here. But that's certainly been the case where the US has essentially sought to get commitments from other countries that they would also maintain a regime of network neutrality. Now, it sort of maps onto the cross-border data flow bit in another way, because at one level the principle seems to me to be that and I think this has been the concern of advocates of network neutrality, that if you allow companies to discriminate, there's a whole range of possible consequences that flow from it. And one of it is that, you might say, okay, a company like a Comcast might say, look, we just want to charge more for downloading videos at certain times at night. There's a good commercial reason for that. But what about, when you have, providers in other countries suddenly refusing to carry particular types of information and data based on its content because it's politically sensitive, because it's from a foreign commercial provider. And so, there's invidious ways that this could be used. So I guess that to the extent that it's kind of in the trade agreements, it's in there. It doesn't really support cross-border data flows because it's more just about the network neutrality and the treatment of content within countries, but it's a principle, I think, which is consistent with thinking about this also in a cross-border sense.
Sir?
I'm an old man, and I can say, I'm not sure I understand 5% of what you've said tonight. I'm used to thinking of trade in the sense that you have a banana war and you can figure out who's being damaged and who isn't. You can talk about dumping steel, and there's a price, and you can see something, and you can agree on measures to make that more equitable. But you're talking about data, and who determines the value of the data? Who is doing the negotiating on this, and who's enforcing it? You may not want to answer that.
No. I'm not an IT specialist, and getting at this issue has similarly required wading through a lot of kind of dense technical language. So I absolutely, sympathise with where you're coming from, and so I guess. In terms of the value question is actually a really good one, because the reality is actually we don't have a good handle on the value question at all. There's some studies which have looked at it, sort of come at it sideways by looking at trying to find correlations between, for instance, internet access and GDP growth and things like that. They've been done by the World Bank and others, which have consistently shown pretty good effects. But in terms of what is the importance of essentially internet-enabled trade of cross-border data flows is there's actually no hard data on it. The International Trade Commission has been tasked essentially to trying to get a handle on this, at least for the US, and they released a first report last year, which didn't really go far. Basically, highlighted the challenges and sort of looked at what the issues were. Another report is coming out in June this year, which is essentially been based on a very extensive survey of companies that use data and engage in internet-enabled trade to try to put some numbers around this. So we don't know, but I think anecdotally, companies have a good sense of the growing role of the internet as an important driver of their own sort of sales, and the extent that these sales are increasingly kind of happening overseas. And so through those types of mechanisms, it's become clear that it's significant from a public policy perspective, but we certainly do need to put some harder numbers on it. So your other questions were who enforces?
Yeah, who is actually negotiating? Who's saying, okay, what's the value of this? And
Yeah.
somebody over in the EU and somebody in Tokyo.
Right. So you know, what's probably going to happen here is what we're essentially looking for is some new rules of the road for this type of activity. So it would be. So going back to what I guess I was saying initially is like, you know, let's say you had a commitment, you know, just a simple, straightforward commitment, not going to restrict cross-border data flows. So if there was a restriction, you know, under those circumstances, you actually don't ever have to show a value of harm, because essentially what the aim is to create essentially more or less a competitive playing field. So it's sort of like the rules of the road, and you know, you don't actually require a separate showing of harm. Once those rules of the road have been affected, then that's all that's needed. There's no need to show any form of damage. In terms of who's negotiating, I mean that's the US. I mean the government negotiators are going to be taking
Commerce
uh,
uh, Department.
Well, it's USTR, United States Trade Representative, who's sort of the actual trade negotiators. You know, it's a multi sort of government agency process, which the Commerce Department feeds into, and the State Department, and a variety of other kind of players.
And who enforces any of the agreements they might reach?
Right. So it depends where the rules are. I mean, if the rules are in the WTO, there's a very comprehensive dispute settlement mechanism. So it's essentially a state-to-state process. There's an appeal, an initial court, and then an appeals court, all happening in Geneva. They produce essentially judicial decisions which are binding in international law. If governments don't comply with them, then the winning government has the capacity to apply trade sanctions. So you know, and the record of compliance is actually very, very high. The TPP and the EU-US agreements, which I was also talking about, will also themselves have, I think, very sophisticated dispute settlement mechanisms, which you know will be probably used to enforce compliance if you get rules in those agreements.
Thank you.
Please, right here.
Bruce Jones mentioned last week that there's a sort of like false narrative out there about China being still this sort of looming threat, and you kind of touched on it when you said that our trade with Europe is trillions of dollars and China's is just a fraction of that. Is China sort of rendering itself obsolete by its kind of protectionist policies as regarding the internet, and also its sort of economic craziness right now?
Look, you know, yeah, it's a complicated question. No, I certainly wouldn't characterise China in those terms. I mean, China is going through a difficult economic reform process as it tries to rebalance its growth away from being sort of essentially investment driven, where investment's been about 50% of GDP, which is crazy high, and you know, export driven as well, to one that is being more consumer driven, which you see in more mature economies. And you know, the transformations that are required to do that are enormous. And you know, there was a plenum, the third plenum last year, which set out a whole range of reforms that they want to take. I think you know, the proof is going to be in the implementation, which is going to take a number of years to see how that goes. You know, on the internet side, you know, there's a growing. Yeah, China's a really big place, right? So it's always, I think, hard to talk about, you know, a particular view in China. I think in a sense of there are different voices and different actors which at different times have more or less say in kind of what's going on there. There's certainly a growing internet community in China which wouldn't look out of place in Silicon Valley, you know, kind of edgy and cool, and you know, thinking in very similar terms that you would expect for you know, those same type of people in the US. And you know, there is a growing and internet sector there, which is certainly though quite domestically focused. It's a part of it is that it's an enormous market, and so the growth potential there has been very significant. So they haven't had to think globally. Part of it is also the policies that the government's had around the internet, which have, I think, prevented, you know, them going global. And so it'll be interesting to see, as some of these players actually look to go global, they start listing on the US stock exchanges and looking to play a greater role outside of China, how their sort of censorship and internet regime develops. But China is confronted by, they do have a very extensive censorship regime, and so there's also this interesting question, I think, of what are the costs in a way. I think it's probably the case that the government will prioritise political stability, and that will include internet censorship for quite a while going forward. It doesn't seem to be, while they seem to be trying to develop some momentum on the economic reform side, not so much on the political reform side. And what are the costs in terms of if you're innovators and entrepreneurs don't have access to all the information that you would want them to have access, if their ability to collaborate online with other people in other countries, that's going to be a drag on their capacity to really be at the cutting edge when it comes to technologies and developing new companies. And so it's hard to quantify what the costs are, but I think the costs are certainly going to be real, and probably over time they're going to have to deal with some of that, I think.
Just 1 second. Let me thank you for asking that question. I'll invite you back in 2 weeks for our next lecture when Michael Hanlon will be here, who's just written a book on U.S.-China relations, and we'll be talking about many issues affecting U.S. strategic policy regarding China. So hope you can all join us. Yes, sir.
The percentage of U.S. U.S. businesses that export is really low, especially small and medium-sized businesses, and the internet has been the great equalizer for a lot of those businesses, but I know many of my clients still are resistant to exporting overseas because of a lot of the time intellectual property protection. I wonder if you can comment on that issue.
Well, on the IP thing specifically, so absolutely an issue for SMEs as well as sort of any size companies. I think part of certainly when one looks at the whole chain of what you need to really maximise the benefits from the internet, right from the internet access bit through to what you need to get the good to the consumer, getting a balanced IP framework is key, right? And that's not only on the IP protection side, which is absolutely important, but it's also getting the balance right in terms of the liabilities for internet service providers, what their obligations are for hosting material, which is infringing copyright and other IP protections. There's obviously a framework here in the US, which is one approach, and it's an approach I think that the US through trade agreements is trying to essentially globalise in many respects. And
it's just really expensive.
Sorry?
It's just really expensive to obtain IP protection overseas.
Yeah, and IP, and so in these FTAs, the IP chapter is probably one of the most controversial and most important parts of it. Partly for the reasons that you're talking about, companies still have major problems, and so getting the IP rules right. With each new trade agreement, there's always the US essentially ratchets it up a bit, because not just for the sake of it, but also partly because new stuff is new technologies develop, new ways of doing things. So new intellectual property rights develop, and then also I think the challenge is even once you've got the rules, you've got to get them enforced, and so that's it's ongoing. Yeah.
Anyone like a last question? Okay. We'll wrap up here. Josh will be available if you have a question you want to ask. And thank you. I hope you can join us in a couple weeks when Michael Hanlon will be here to talk about U.S. and China, and hopefully some of his experiences. He's right now in Afghanistan talking to U.S. military leaders there, doing some policy work. So it should be a very interesting and timely discussion. Thanks again for coming, and hope to see you in a couple weeks.